There's some surprising connections between the Dead Sea Scrolls and Christianity. I want to walk you through 5 of those today. Make sure you stick around to the 5th one because it has serious implications for the legitimacy of the Reformation. It sent some modern scholars back to the drawing board, and you'll really want to dig in to see what's going on there. But the first one I want to talk to you about today is Messianic Expectations. And to really get your mind around this, I'm going to have you think back in your mind to the time when John the Baptist was put into prison. He'd already proclaimed before that Jesus was a Messiah, but it seems like he's having second thoughts. And he sends messengers to Jesus to say, "Are you the one, or should we look for somebody else?" And we'll pick up the story in Matthew chapter 11 and verse 3, where Jesus replies to these messengers that John sent. And he says, "Go and show John again those things which ye do hear and see. The blind receive their sight, the lame walk, the lepers are cleansed, and the deaf hear. The dead are raised up, and the poor have the gospel preached to them." Now, why did Jesus answer that way? And why didn't he just say, "Yes, I'm the Messiah," or something like that? How did John understand that? How was John supposed to gather from that he was the Messiah? Well, for one thing, it does look like he's alluding to Isaiah 35, which in itself is really fascinating. I wish we had time to go into that. But there's some elements in that aren't really in Isaiah 35, like the dead being raised up. Well, what's fascinating is there's a passage in the Dead Sea Scrolls, and this is in 4Q521. And let me just pick up my copy of the Dead Sea Scrolls, my English copy here, and I'll read it to you what it says here, the relevant portion. This is a messianic prophecy, passage in the Dead Sea Scrolls, and it reads like this. "And the Lord shall do glorious things, which have not been done, just as he said, for he shall heal the critically wounded, he shall revive the dead, he shall send good news to the afflicted, he shall satisfy the poor, he shall guide the uprooted, he shall make the hungry rich." This is very interesting because of the parallels, especially where he's talking about this reviving of the dead in the context of this messianic age. And so this has really stirred up some scholars to wonder about this. It's called the Redemption and Resurrection Scroll. So that they've said things like this, and now I'm going to quote to the introduction of this section here from the Wise Abed Cook edition of the Dead Sea Scrolls. They write this: "Both the Gospels and this scroll presuppose that during the age of the Messiah, the dead will be resurrected either by God himself or through his messianic agent. Yet nowhere in the Old Testament do we clearly read of this belief. This fact suggests that the gospel writers may have known redemption and resurrection, or at least been familiar with the traditions it contains. Thus, Jesus' response to John's disciples was, 'Yes, I am he.' His works reflected the messianic expectation." So at a minimum, what this shows is that people around the time of Jesus were thinking of the Messiah figure in these kinds of terms that Jesus laid out for the messengers that were coming to John. Now, that brings us to an interesting question. Why did the gospel writers think that John would have understood this? Why didn't they add some clarification? Well, it could be because this document was circulating around during that time, but there's another theory that's out there that John the Baptist himself may have been in some way connected with the group that was in Qumran. That was the area that these Dead Sea Scrolls have been found, that he may have been associated with that group. Now, that's going to be the subject of the next point. We're going to talk about that in just a moment. But I want to mention to you about this messianic expectation that the group in Qumran, probably the Essenes, we think it was probably the Essenes, they had a belief in like 2 messiahs. So one priestly and one royal. Now, we as Christians know that the priestly element and the royal element have come together in Jesus. What's fascinating to me is that all these signs could be done in front of them, and yet they miss it. But let's hasten on now to our second point. Second point is John the Baptist. Was he in some way connected to these scrolls? what's interesting is that some scholars think, and some scholars have argued, that John himself was an Essene, that he was part of the group that would have been in possession of these scrolls. Now, let me give you 6 points that they raised to say that John may have been an Essene, and then we'll evaluate that and see if we think that they're right or not. Number one, they see the connection between the Essenes and John the Baptist in the fact that they both practice this very ascetic lifestyle. Both groups practice celibacy. So that's the first one. Number two, they both had priestly origins. Number three, think of Luke chapter 1, verse 80. This is after John the Baptist has been born, obviously, and Luke gives us a summary, and it says this, that John grew and waxed strong in spirit and was in the deserts till the day of his showing unto Israel. Now think about that. If John is, as a child, growing up in the desert, who is raising John? Who's doing the raising of John? And that brings us to a fascinating point of connection between this Essene group, John the Baptist, and Josephus, because Josephus provides a quote for us, and he says this, "These Essenes reject pleasures as an evil, but esteem continence and the conquest over our passions to be virtue. They neglect wedlock, but choose out of other persons' children, while they are pliable and fit for learning, and esteem them to be of their kindred, and form them according to their own manners." So what's fascinating here is that, according to Josephus, this Essene community, which most scholars believe, again, to repeat myself, were in possession of these scrolls, they were rearing other people's children who'd come out in the desert. Now, John happened to be raised out in the desert, it says. So that's another point of connection that these scholars would argue for. So my fourth point is they shared a prophetic focus. That is, they both had a focus on a particular prophecy out of the book of Isaiah in verse 43. I won't take the time to read it to you, but you can read it for yourself, where the Qumran community thought of themselves as those that were the voice out in the wilderness, preparing the way of the Lord, making straight in the desert a highway for our God. John the Baptist, as it shows us in the Gospels, he too was fond of saying that he was the voice in the wilderness. So that's another connection that some people have made. They both have this sort of eschatological outlook. John the Baptist is warning of the destruction that's coming, and also the Essene community had that kind of concern. The sixth point of contact would be in baptism. So, as we all know, John the Baptist was a baptizer, right? Well, so were the Essenes. The Essenes were baptizing, doing regular baptisms. And so, for these reasons and some others, some scholars, I'm not going to say it's the majority view, it's probably a minority view right now, think that John the Baptist was an Essene. And if so, may have looked at some of these very scrolls that we're talking about here today. Now, do I think John the Baptist was an Essene? I think it's a stretch. I don't think he was an Essene. What I do think is possible is that he had some connection with the Essenes. But this is a complicated question, and there's some arguments that go back and forth. So I want to know what you think in the comment section. Do you think that John the Baptist was an Essene? I think it's very possible that he had some connection with them. He was probably familiar with them. He was in the same general vicinity as they would have been. But there were too many discontinuities between John the Baptist. For one, the biggest one, the Essene community were diametrically opposed in some ways to some of the things that Jesus was teaching. They would have found Jesus's teachings to be absolutely heretical. So at the least, we have to say that John the Baptist had to make a break at some point with this Essene community. I'm skeptical that he was part of that community, but let me know what you think. Okay, that brings us to number 3, halakhic practice. When I refer to halakhic practice, I'm talking about the application of Jewish law in everyday life, just how it applies pretty much everywhere, and how you behave as a Jew. Well, this point is one in which we make a contrast. So in order to really understand Christianity, we need to understand the Jewish background in which it came up. Well, let me just say it this way. as a Christian who's read the Gospels, you're familiar with his Pharisees as being very, very strict. Jesus says you tithe on mint and anise and cumin and omit the weightier matters of the law. They were exacting in regards to the law. They got it right down to the letter of the law. However, when you study the Dead Sea Scrolls, the Pharisees were actually the liberals in comparison to the Essenes. The Essenes were so strict. Like there's a portion in the Dead Sea Scrolls. I was going to read it to you, but this video is already getting longer than I thought it would, where they talk about taking a unclean vessel and a clean vessel. I know this might just bear with me for a second. You take the clean vessel and you pour it into the unclean vessel. Well, that stream that goes from the unclean vessel will go all the way up and contaminate the clean vessel. And so this is one of the ways that they divided themselves from other Jews, and not so much over doctrine, but over practice and keeping the law to the utmost degree. And the contrast to this is for them, I quoted for you or showed you that they like to use Isaiah chapter 40 and verse 3, a voice crying out in the wilderness. What was it they were talking about? Well, they were going to be the community that was going to exact the law of Moses. You can see the contrast here, where Jesus has this emphasis on love your neighbor as yourself and love the Lord thy God with all thy heart, soul, mind, and strength. And upon this, all the law and the prophets hang. This is a bold contrast of someone who is setting himself in opposition to these people who are very particular, very rigorous in their execution of the law. I think Jesus' critique of the Pharisees would have equally applied to the Qumran community. So let's go into point number 4, and that is textual criticism. So not only do we have a number of Dead Sea Scrolls which deal with some of the things that I just talked to you about, the halakhic practice and what you should do, what you shouldn't do, who's part of the community, who's not part of the community, page after these rules and things of how they understood the Bible, but there are actually Bible manuscripts as well, as you probably know, amongst the Dead Sea Scrolls. One of the things that this has helped us in terms of understanding not only Christianity but Judaism is the continuity and integrity of the Bible that we have. Before the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered, one of our most ancient copies of the Hebrew Bible that we have dated to about 900 A.D. This takes us back to 1,000 years before that. And what we see is the basic integrity of the Bible preserved. But there are some intriguing things. There's some people like me who sort of nerd out on some of these little nuances, little differences. One of my favorite examples is in Psalm 22:16, where the standard Hebrew text, rather than having "they have pierced my hands and my feet," has something like, instead of pierced, like a lion. What does a lion have to do with piercing? It doesn't sound like a messianic prophecy when you read it in an Orthodox Jewish translation of the Hebrew Bible. That's because their Hebrew text there is different than what some other versions had. So the Septuagint, the Syriac, or the Vulgate had something more like "they pierced or dug my hands and my feet." Well, what was fascinating as they began to uncover manuscripts around Qumran is that they discovered a scroll that had this, "they have pierced my hands and my feet." And this was published in the Dead Sea Scrolls Bible in 1997. So those sorts of things are fascinating. That brings me to the 5th point, the scrolls and the new perspective on Paul. There's a particular Dead Sea Scroll, 4QMMT, which has brought enormous controversy. Questions like, was Paul radically breaking with Judaism like the Reformers said? Does Judaism, did early Judaism teach that you had to earn your salvation through good works? And one of the fascinating things that happened is basically outside of the corpus of Paul, this term works of the law was pretty well unheard of. So people were trying to find, what did Paul mean by works of the law? Did he mean all works of the law, both moral and ceremonial? Or did he just mean like the ceremonial law? What did Paul mean by works of the law? Well, when this text came to light, 4QMMT, scholars began to look at that. They said, oh, this community out in Qumran are using this to refer to these specific ceremonial things. Not talking about thou shalt not kill, not talking about loving your neighbor as yourself, but as, how you keep these specific ritual type things. And so enormous debate erupted about what are the works of the law. And so some modern scholars have argued, well, the works of the law are just talking about ceremonial works of the law. More specifically, not so much ceremonial works of the law, rather something that has to do with ethnic boundary markers. And so for the reformers, Paul was combating perhaps legalism. I'm oversimplifying here, I know this, but you can nuance this in the comments, feel free. Where the reformers are talking about Paul's combating legalism, what Paul is actually dealing with is ethnic boundary markers. Well, this has radical implications. Recent works by N.T. Wright and John Piper have gone head-to-head about this. What's interesting to me, though, is 4QMMT has been used both by the critics of the New Perspective on Paul and by the defenders of the New Perspective on Paul. I want to read to you a relevant passage now from 4QMMT, and I'll display the full text on the screen for you here so you can get all of it, but I'm going to hit the highlights. It says, now we have written to you some of the works of the law. And then he talks about how that they're to keep these works of the law, understand them. And he says, then you shall rejoice at the end time when you find the essence of our words to be true, and it will be reckoned to you as righteousness. And so some of the people who have critiqued the New Perspective of Paul have said, look, this is exactly what these people were thinking. They were thinking legalistic terms. If they kept these works of the law, then they would somehow earn righteousness at the last day. And so the debate has gone on and on. We don't have the time to adjudicate this debate in full. I'll tell you that my view is that Paul does have in mind some things other than just ethnic boundary markers when he's talking about works. However, that debate would take us far afield from our purposes for today. All I want to do is kind of mark out for you that these scrolls do have enormous implications, even for modern debates, even in fact, the endeavor of the Reformation itself. Hey, if you like that, you want to see more about the Dead Sea Scrolls, particularly how it impacts textual variants, take a look at this video right here.